Yep. Cue that up there. Good morning, everybody. Okay. I am Jim H. He's Jim H. I'm with an E and he's with an I, or he's with an A. So we got to get that on full screen too. So Jim had asked me, we've done a lot of work through the years with Jim and his firm. And as he mentioned, I spend a lot of my time traveling and teaching and kind of observing what's going on nationally in terms of growth. And I do a lot of instruction through the Urban Land Institute, which is a national kind of research and policy group focused on wise land use and creating thriving communities. And a lot of the programs and courses I do are around mixed use, sustainable development, residential development, and I've been doing this for a number of years. And the past 12 months have been really interesting because I've had an opportunity to take the courses to about 5 different cities across the country, look at about 40 different projects, talk to about 30 different developers. And while every place is different, there is clearly something big going on out there right now. I think we are in a sea change that is occurring across the country, especially coming out of what we've been through in the last recession. And there is a real shift that is going on, and it's being driven by a couple of things that I'll talk about. But the other thing, I was struck by the question this morning about the 2040 horizon, and I was thinking about this morning. And you think about if you were sitting here doing the same exercise 25 years ago, because 2040 is like 25 years now. So if you were sitting here in 1988 doing the same exercise, you'd be going in a world and we'd be talking about the future when there was no smartphones, there was no iPods, there was no internet, there was no Starbucks. The kind of thoughts about economic development were largely the shopping mall. It was probably anchored by a Sears. So you think about what's happened and really transformed kind of the landscape of communities in the last 25 years. And so some of the stuff I'll show, you have to suspend a little disbelief and say, well, you know, that's big city, that's not Gilroy. But there are clearly some things going on that I think are relevant everywhere. And there are pieces of those lessons that are worth taking as you go into this exercise this morning, especially because this front end part of the general plan is really kind of thinking big and thinking to the future. So think about how rapidly things have changed in the last 25 years and what might actually be possible. Another great touch point for me was just to read the postcards that were done in the workshops prior. And just a lot of the things that people were asking for or had envisioned wanting to say about the community when those were to be sent out are very consistent with what is going on elsewhere. So with that, let's just go here. So first of all, I want to talk about just a couple of trends. And there is a significant trend, and it is called the millennials. You've probably heard this ad nauseum. We'll probably get as tired of hearing about the millennials as we used to hear about the baby boomers. But they are, and it's one of the big takeaways, and I'll give you a few more facts and figures, but they are really significant. But this is some work that was done about 2 years ago from a researcher that I do a lot of work with out of the Brookings Institute. And it was really looking at where growth over the last 10 years really went, because there's been a lot of discussion about everybody's moving back to the city and the suburbs are dead and all those kinds of things. And really what happened in all the growth that was occurring was the urban cores pretty much stayed the same. There were some cities, obviously, that got a lot of growth and some that didn't, but as a general, the urban cores stayed the same. The far out exurbs kind of stayed the same, but the two growth areas were those first ring suburbs, those kind of great old neighborhoods around the urban core, and the so-called emerging suburbs or emerging towns. And there's some other research about where people want to live. In a small town, kind of not rural, but that kind of small town, I know a lot of people really appreciate and value the town character and feel of this place, that's where people want to live going forward. There's a big cohort that want to live going forward. Sorry, that may be a little hard to read there, but the millennials are clearly changing the game. This is from a recent report that just came out, America in 2013, actually came out last year, but and it was talking about the different generations. And Gen Y stands out as the most urban, multicultural, and transient generation in America today. 40% of Gen Y is Latino or African American. So diversity is a big part of the coming generation, and yet they don't think of diversity the way that we do. They don't kind of segment it because it's very much a blended, it's very much just a way of life. And so it's a very important part of the way that they're thinking about communities in the future. The other thing that's really important about millennials is they are the biggest generation ever. So we've heard a lot for years about the baby boomers and how starting in the 60s they kind of transformed everything that they did, from politics to economics to the housing markets. Millennials are bigger than the baby boomers are. And what's happening is there's two very interesting things. You've got the millennials, which are driving one end of growth, and you've got the baby boomers, which are now retiring, are driving another end of growth. So you have this kind of huge dumbbell, and Gen X and some of the others that are in between are much smaller by comparison. So what the baby boomers decide to do in their retirement years and what the millennials decide to do both in their work formation, employment, and their household formation years will have a big impact on communities in the next 20 years. So this is a really interesting survey that just came out, and it's what I characterize it, what do we want to, what do people want in their neighborhoods? And so this was looking across all three generations. And you know, there's been a lot of talk, the realtors always talk about what people want. We have our biases about what we individually want to live near. But across, if you look across the top here, so it's the three cohorts, the boomers, the Gen X, and the Gen Y. The number one so-called amenity that people want to live or have close to their neighborhoods is a grocery store, which seems kind of utilitarian. But the grocery store is no longer just pick up groceries for the week. It's an important part of daily life and the way that people like to live. And it's not just any grocery store, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The second one is just restaurants close by, and having restaurants and mixed use and walkable kinds of things that are part of the entertainment. And then those are consistent across all three groups. Then it starts to change a little bit. For the baby boomers and Gen X, it's walking trails. For millennials, it's fitness centers. But again, it's dealing with recreation. You could say recreation in general. And that is a big part of what drives attracting talent, which then attracts jobs. And then it kind of goes on down the list from there. But it's really interesting that the qualities, the things that make up neighborhoods, the kinds of things that we think about, grocery stores, restaurants nearby, stuff that I don't have to get in the car and drive 30 minutes to, are really what are shaping kind of people's decisions about where they live and how they live on a daily basis. And that's why I put this up here. In the last 3 tours that I've done around the country, we've kind of come to shorthand is to say the Whole Foods effect. And that desire for a grocery store, Whole Foods is kind of the premier grocery store, obviously, if you can get it. But having that in the neighborhood, in every project we've seen, it typically adds like 20% value to the units that are within 2 blocks of that. So there's a direct correlation of people wanting to live near a grocery, a high-quality green grocer. It doesn't have to be Whole Foods. Trader Joe's is another good example. But people want to have that grocery experience close by, not just so they can pick up stuff on a daily basis, but it's an important part of their lifestyle. It's what they're choosing. And so it speaks to the idea of finer grained neighborhoods as opposed to the traditional grocery anchored shopping center. So the second big trend is this thing called the sharing economy, and it's clearly being driven by the millennials because for a couple of reasons. One is economics, but the other is just the way that they don't really want to own a lot of stuff. They want the mobility that comes with being able to just kind of borrow something or use it on a short-term basis and spend their money elsewhere. One of the big kind of outcomes of this, I don't know if you've seen the statistics, but the number of people getting driver's licenses between 16 and 24 is at the lowest that it's ever been. People are not getting driver's license the way they used to. We all couldn't wait to get out of the house and get away from our parents. They don't need to do that anymore. They just kind of hang out with their friends, so they've got the smartphones and they network in a different way. So the car manufacturers are deathly afraid of this because there just isn't the interest in owning a car the way there was. And a lot of it is because there's these car sharing things. Car sharing, bike sharing, there's Airbnb where people are just sharing stuff because they don't want to own it, they just want to use it for a short time. This is fundamentally changing in a lot of ways the workplace and what's going on in the workplace. So instead of everybody having an office, there are now shared offices. This is a huge phenomenon that we see in the urban centers where what this is a chart of showing the rates of what you can rent a desk for, a half day, a day, a week, a month. So instead of the usual thing of somebody rents an office and puts 3 people in per 1,000, it's now changing to 8, 10, 12 people per 1,000 because they're moving through so quickly. And people are in for a day or so. And that used to be in the centers, but I live up in Healdsburg, and Petaluma just put one of these in. It's doing very, very well. So even the small towns are getting this because people that are mobile that are entrepreneurial, that are not working in the traditional jobs, are actually looking for ways to work differently, but more importantly, they're looking for ways to network and meet other people like themselves. So the big part of this is not cheap space that I can use on a flexible basis. It's being in an environment where on a daily basis I'm meeting people who are thinking like me, that are doing creative things, that are working differently, that I might want to partner with for this new project, and then somebody else for a different project. So it's a very, very different way of thinking about jobs and employment than what we used to think about, that you bring in the employer, they hire somebody and they work there for 30 years. Now people have multiple jobs over multiple time spans and working in different environments. The other big thing about millennials then, because they're saving all that money by not owning a car and not spending a lot of office space, is they are spending a lot more on food and beverage. And so that kind of entertainment, social connection space, great street lights, restaurants, all of that kind of stuff is very, very important to both building neighborhoods, but also to attracting that kind of talent. And I think what we're finding in a lot of places is once you have the talent, the jobs kind of follow. There's kind of this, it's a little bit of a reverse from where it used to be, where you got the big employers and then people move to the jobs. Now talent is coming and the jobs are falling. The third thing is the way that people are changing the way they think about housing. And again, as people are sharing more, especially the millennials, they're thinking about housing in less. So that the average house size is shrinking. I think it peaked about in 2006 or 2007. It's actually getting smaller. And in some of the urban centers, it's getting very, very small, partially from an affordability standpoint, but very much from a lifestyle standpoint. And one of the guys who runs a lot of housing analysis had this great quote that the way that people look at their housing now is it's a place where I sleep, and where I actually live is out in the neighborhood. It's down on the street where there's bars and restaurants are. It's in that place where I work and share with my friends, and all of those kinds of things. So it allows you to have a lot less space and spend more time out in the neighborhood, and therefore the neighborhood, the quality, and there are a number of the postcards that talked about the wonderful downtown in the future, how important that is to attracting and keeping both talent and jobs in the future. Interestingly, too, coming out of this, there was a lot of discussion, obviously, with a lot of the foreclosures and the decline of the housing market, or the really disruption, that there was this temporary thing where a lot of people were renting houses. And I think the numbers are getting in now that that is not just a temporary thing, but that's actually going to be a permanent trend that will stay for a long time. So 35% of all single-family homes comprise 35% of all rentals. So it's no longer you live in an apartment and save up and then move into a house that you buy. Single-family home rentals are a very important part of the business, and grow increasingly so that people are actually building new homes purely for the rental basis. And so just think about how that might change land use, how that changes and informs neighborhoods, the constant kind of fluidity of those neighborhoods, and how you maintain those. And then there's this whole notion of, that came out of a report that was done about 2 years ago that says that if you combine all of those things, people wanting to rent more, have less space, maybe be a little bit more mobile, that a lot of what has been built in the past, a lot of the big homes, will be plenty of supply for those that still want that. But where the real gap is in this middle column here, the multifamily and kind of the smaller townhomes and townhouse kind of complexes. That there are people that is no longer an economic choice, that's actually a lifestyle choice. People want that kind of lock and lead lifestyle. It comes from both ends. Baby boomers that don't want to have a big house, millennials and lifestyles and baby boomers. It's a very important part of harnessing and attracting that kind of development. So, and we used to do mixed use really well. I mean, even in downtown here, even though there's some empty spaces in that, a lot of that was about mixed use. It was just something before World War I that we knew how to do, because you had small builders and you had shop owners that built their shops and that lived above it. It was something we were very familiar with. But then we kind of forgot about that right after World War I, introduced the new zoning practices that result in kind of the separation of land uses, very much an auto-driven environment. And so now we're returning back to the idea of mixed use. And one of the interesting things that just came out was a study that the National Trust for Historic Preservation did, and it combined kind of old school thinking with new school technology. And so it looked at existing neighborhoods in 3 cities And it looked at the diversity of those neighborhoods, the economic vitality, the number of job startups, the number of women and minority-owned businesses, and the economic success of those. And what they found were neighborhoods that had the finest grain, the smallest block sizes, the smallest building sizes, the most number of kind of the diversity of age in the buildings were those that had the highest, what they call James scores, for famous planner Jane Jacobs. And it had the highest score in terms of economic vitality, job growth, all of those things that really matter to people. And they used some really interesting techniques. They looked at cell phone activity at like 10 o'clock on a Friday night. Which areas had the highest amounts of cell phone activity? Which areas had the highest ratings from Yelp? And so they're using a lot of these kind of new technologies to figure out where do people want to be, and then how does that correlate with economic development and economic vitality. And it all kind of came back that there's a very strong correlation between the quality of the community and the neighborhood scale and fabric, which are things that are very, very important in the design as you think about future land use. So a lot of people have this perception that a mixed use has to be ground floor retail, maybe there's an office above and residential up above, which is really nice and it's really romantic and it draws really well. It's really, really hard to develop. So mixed use now is becoming more of this study where you might have some employment, some residential, and some retail in separate buildings. It makes it a little bit easier to finance. But the key is getting them all together, getting that, again, that grain correct at the street level so that it's walkable. The restaurants kind of feed the residences and all that kind of stuff. So what we're finding out is mixed use as an idea is a really good idea. How you actually get it developed is much more challenging, and the idea of maybe doing these incrementally in individual buildings actually seems to work a little bit better. The other reason that mixed use is so important is Jim had mentioned, there was discussion about the One Bay Area plan. It's all tied back to sustainability. The state's made a very big emphasis on reducing greenhouse gases. There's a direct correlation between mixed uses and the amount of greenhouse gases that individuals emit largely through transportation. But the key thing about mixed use is all of these lifestyle things, the benefits then of car sharing, of co-located workspaces, of the vitality of those restaurants, they all have to be together. You can't just have one without the other and hope that it's going to come. And so the idea is that there's a synergy that has to be carefully curated, kind of work together, and everybody that is in the middle of this stuff says it is a constant work. It's not something where, in the last 20 years, you build a shopping center and it would generally just kind of chug along, go on autopilot. Mixed use requires a lot more hand-holding, a lot more nurturing, a lot more constant refinement, but that's what makes it very interesting. So you have to constantly be working to make sure that all of these elements are interconnected. And then the last one I wanted to talk about, this has been, I think, the big especially coming out of 2008. So looking at all the places that I've been, and what's happening both through the internet in terms of retailing, individual buyer habits, and then just kind of the conventional way that we're approaching and building communities. So the conventional retail wisdom was, again, that you had these big credit tenants and they anchored the shopping center, and the shopping center filled in with all these little shops. And the reality is that in every place that we've been, if you talk to any developer who's really in the game right now, they're saying there are no anchor tenants anymore. There are no credit tenants. I mean, 15 years ago, everybody would have died to get a Borders bookstore in the shopping center, and that's, you could probably name all of the stores that were the so-called credit tenants that are no longer there. So there's a fine art now of finding the right tenant, getting the amount of retail correct, and that's another big lesson that we've learned as we've gone around. That there's a notion that mixed use always has to have ground floor retail. All the great downtowns have retail on every block, and there is only so much retail that can be supported by communities. There's only so much retail that can be supported in the neighborhoods. And so in order to make sure it succeeds, you have to use it very judiciously, and you have to help support it in order to make sure that it really is an amenity for the neighborhood. Because as one of the developers said, bad retail is worse than no retail. You build the retail center and it doesn't rent and it's empty and it looks blighted, and then something really awful comes in and uses it to pay the rent, and it really drags down the neighborhood. So you have to be very, very careful how you develop that. And then as a part of that is really what's happening out there on the street. So what's happened before, if you remember the big shopping malls, they were very much an inward-oriented experience. The millennials, I think even the baby boomers, great towns now are all about an outward experience, how that retail and residents express themselves outward. It's really about being out in the street and enjoying kind of that being out in the public space. So, and another one that's really, I think, particularly given where you are in the agricultural heritage and sitting here in this amazing landscape, is just the role of food, because the millennials are foodies, the baby boomers are foodies, and food has become a real competitive advantage. And people want to know where their food's coming from. They want to taste unique foods. And they're willing to spend a lot more. I mean, you look at the rise of Whole Foods, it's not cheap. It's not because it's the cheapest game in town, but there's a quality implied, there's a uniqueness implied, and there's a quality of just the whole shopping experience. So food as a point of reference. And this is actually a new building in my town, Healdsburg, that's all around food, and it talks about celebrating and connecting people closer to the food in the region. But this is, it's actually a Butler building that's very, very high end, but it's really become kind of a signature statement of connecting people and food in the region to what's unique in that area. And it's also about authenticity and placemaking. And I think, again, this is something that's very, very high in the ranks of millennials and baby boomers, is how do you make places feel real and authentic? Food is one of those ways, because you don't get, if it is local, it very much speaks to the place. And this is the Grange at the Shed, which again was harkening back, creating a gathering place that's very much about the agricultural area of the region. And then even as it gets incorporated into our communities, as lots get smaller, as people move into multifamily or townhomes and things like that, the idea of community-supported agriculture or community agriculture is a way for people to connect. It's just like that image I showed of the offices, there being about people wanting to come together with their coworkers. Community gardening is a way for people to come together with their neighbors, share stories, take care of, trade lessons, and not have the burden of a big yard, but still be able to get out and engage with the soil. So, just to wrap up, there's a couple lessons that I've written down just kind of from the various trips and things that I've been seeing. The first one is that all of this stuff takes time. I think there was an awful lot of hope, probably in the early 2000s, that there was a silver bullet, and all throughout, I think, downtown development. You open a convention center, you build an aquarium, you build a new shopping mall, it's going to solve all the problems. And none of these silver bullets have ever worked. It's really a series of what somebody once called silver BBs. Just little kind of surgical things that you're doing, and you have to do them continually over time and continually monitor them. There's a lot of debate about parking as people do more transit, as people do more sharing, how much parking is too much, how much is not enough, and as you get to these more urban formats, there's a fine line that people are really trying to figure out how much parking you really need. A lot of cities are going to parking maximums instead of parking minimums, so that it really does start to create that vitality, and it makes it possible for people to not have to own cars, but to use some of these other forms of transportation. The changing nature of employment, I just put down here, this tech environment is going to 8, 10 per thousand. We were just talking about the UNFI facility, at maybe that's 1 per thousand or 1 per 1,500. So two very different ends of the spectrum of how do you, so when you think about how much land you zone and place into different uses, what kind of uses are those, and what kind of jobs do those actually create? And the idea of neighborhood retail is so important to both creating place, connecting communities, and attracting people to live in places. Does it ultimately become a subsidized amenity? It's very, very difficult sometimes for these things to work on their own, and a lot of developers I'm working with, instead of building a golf course, they're building a Main Street, and that's kind of the thing that they have to fund up front, because that's what makes it work. And then finally, if you get all of this stuff right, and I think it's a really important, the places that have done it right, now they're struggling with the idea of affordability, and not in the sense that they don't have the income level within the community to buy housing. The housing has gotten so expensive because so many people want to live there. And one of the lessons learned from a lot of these really desirable places to live is to be very thoughtful and strategic early on about acquiring and assuming the land that you need for future affordable housing, because affordable housing in many ways is like infrastructure. It's a component, making sure that the people that live, the first responders, the teachers, the people that work in the in these great downtowns can live there, because they're a vital part of that community. So just just making sure that that becomes part of your future thinking. With that, that's the end. So.
Do we have questions for Jim?
Yeah, one of the things that struck me is that when you talk about how the sharing economy and the new economic structure, the amount of disposable income that people have, affects housing and housing types. Where it seems like people have been moving in pretty traditional manner and coping with this. I mean, you talk about apartments, you talk about multifamily, but it strikes me if you analyze the uses, there are a number of aspects of an individual suburban house that could be sharing, like, thinking radically, even kitchens, family recreation rooms where people watch TV and everything. Is there any kind of a movement across the country to move towards sort of sharing more sharing built into more affordable options, where people share community gardens, they share kitchens, they share family rooms, and then they have, of course, their own private spaces and their own bathrooms and stuff like that?
Yeah, so the question was, in that, we talked a little bit about the sharing economy, and has that translated to some of the more conventional forms of housing, so that you've got some of these larger homes, but really, in some ways, could set themselves up well to sharing some of the common areas, the kitchens, the family rooms, the gardens, but then still have your private spaces. And I would say yes on two fronts. So one of the older models that has been around for probably 20 years is called co-housing. And that is done, there's a number of really great projects, and actually Berkeley, I think, is kind of where a lot of this started. But a small group of people, say 20 to 40 like-minded people, might get together and build smaller units. They build better common spaces. They may build a great, kind of what's called a great house, which is typically a big kitchen where they can come together for meals if they want, but they still have kitchens in their homes. But the idea is that by coming together and doing that, they can actually do it more affordably because the developer's not speculatively building it. So that's been around a while. That's been very successful. And again, it's typically for people who are like-minded and want a little more community than they might get in just a conventional setting. The other thing that is just starting to emerge is there are some builders who are building kind of shared homes, and they're for large extended families. So especially in a lot of the diverse ethnic families that live beyond, the nuclear family really lives together, or there are multiple, they're just big families. They're building homes that might have multiple. They might have a big kitchen, but they might actually have a series of casitas and other units actually on the same lot, and they share the lot and the garage. And it's for seniors, the kids are taking care of them. So there's some interesting products like that are just starting to emerge in response to that.
Don't developments like Babylon and stuff and they have like theater facilities and recreation rooms and small apartments and then and all the like lower floor don't they have shared areas like that?
Absolutely. So yeah, a lot of the stuff that we've seen, I mean, we jokingly call it an arms race in amenities. I just came back from DC 2 weeks ago. And the amounts, first of all, the amount of public space that's being created, because again, the units are getting much smaller. And so, but it's also because people want to just hang out with each other. So the rec rooms, cappuccino rooms, the theater rooms, the fitness rooms, the barbecue areas, all of that kind of stuff is very much becoming a big part of the programming. So.
And your travels around, are there communities out there that so-called maybe Gilroy could have identified as plans that they're talking about? It seems like their plans are not, I'm not looking at it as Gilroy, are there any examples out there that have been initiated already or in the process?
Yeah, I was trying to think of that this morning because yes. So the question was interesting examples, but are there any that maybe are more either scaled or consistent with kind of the Gilroy kind of community and stuff like that? And it is hard to find examples because I think what's happening is there's an enormous amount of mobility, and people are either moving to the cities by choice, and so that's fueling kind of these downtown cores. I mean, DC, the number we heard was there's 1,100 people a month moving into the town, into the core. So, but So,
The reason is, I'm looking at it from our area, our community, it's so diverse, and what we have out there for jobs, it's diverse, it's community now. But just what needs to be done or established, or you would recommend, or to make this a vibrant community, having the concerns of who we are here.
right.
That's what I know it's a tough question, but.
No, it's a great question, and it's challenging. I noticed a lot of emphasis on the arts, and there's a group called Art Space that does a lot of these in small towns and big towns. It comes in, and their basic theory, and they've done a very good job. They build affordable housing for artists in downtown core, and their basic theory is that the artists, once you give them housing, they will stay in a community and make more of a community than a lot of other people who kind of move in and out. And they actually, the arts are really what brand and make communities more unique in terms of their character. So I think the arts is one area where people are really finding some traction in terms of creating both energy within the community and attracting people and identity for the place.
So, I mean, I can see the attractiveness of what we're looking at for where people live, and boy, the description fits both of my kids, how they live their lives. But, you know, when we look at kind of the bigger development of a general plan that goes beyond just kind of these neighborhood communities, where does industry fit in? Because as much as it's nice having retail in everywhere, I mean, you still have to have industry in the nation. Where does that fit with, where do you put that in the people that are here, where does industry come?
Right, so the question was, where does industry fit in a general plan process like this when you've got great neighborhood ideas, but how does industry actually fit into the discussion? And I think the point I was trying to make, and I know that you have an economic consultant who's done a lot more work on this and knows it better than I do, but I just encourage you to think differently about the traditional industries the way that maybe have been thought about in the past, because I think the jobs are changing so rapidly that maybe what was being pursued in the general plan 2002 may not be out there anymore, or may be very, very limited. So are there other industries that you could be thinking about, or other kinds of jobs that maybe aren't, again, it's not the silver bullet that one employer bringing in 500 jobs, but are there 20 employers that are bringing in 25 jobs each? And how do you actually accommodate that and attract that? How do you create an environment that would attract that? So, there's a question.
Could you elaborate more on, you said there was a correlation between mixed-use development and carbon footprint. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, some of the analysis, and a lot of this, again, is kind of numbers because there hasn't been enough in place, but on a very gross basis, they're saying that individuals that live in a mixed-use environment, which means you can walk more places or you have alternatives for transportation, typically have a carbon footprint, or they can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions as an individual by almost 40%. And that, again, relies on there being transit available. But even if the average person in a suburban environment takes 11 or 10 or 11 trips per day by car, if you're in a mixed-use environment, you can do 4 of those by some other means, even if it's just walking. You obviously cut 40% of your vehicle emissions out. And you might be able, you still may be in your car, but you can actually travel shorter distances. How are we doing on time?
Well, yeah, let's take 2 or 3 more questions and we'll get to our exercise. We have a question here and a question over here.
Okay. And then we're going to take a break, so if people want to talk after, I'm happy to do that.
Gilroy has the jobs, housing, imbalance. Most people like to move out. So and we know that Gen Ys are probably going to become Gen X's or baby boomers by the time this general plan goes out. So what are the trends showing, or where do you think we're going to be the Gen Ys today? Where will they going to be in 2040?
That is a great question, and the subject of much, yes. So the question was, where will Gen Y be when this plan hits its horizon year? So the Gen Y, the millennials talked about, are driving a lot of things, but what will they want in by 2040, I guess, 25 years, and what will they be looking for? And there's 2 camps. There's a camp that says The millennials have a very different set of values, and they will continue to live in high walkable, mixed-use urban environments because they believe in it environmentally and they want it socially. And there's another camp that says when they get married and start to have kids and they have to deal with schools and all the issues that we had to deal with, they're going to move to the suburbs. And I think that the analysis is kind of 50-50 split. So I think those that will succeed, those towns that will succeed, will be those that have great schools, that maybe can provide a more affordable environment for housing, but still have that sense of town and walkability and social life. And I think that's why in that first slide, the inner rings are really the ones that are the growth opportunities, because they have that kind of small town feel. They still have a lot of that kind of great grain that I talked about in terms of streets and things, but they're not, you're not downtown and dealing with public schools and the urban cores and all that. One more question.
Yes, I think this is really interesting. I'm just wondering, how do you bring the development community into acknowledging these trends in terms of their building? A lot of times you hear certain types of building just doesn't pencil out for them financially, so they want to do the traditional old style. I don't know where they are at this, in this way.
Yeah, so you heard the question was, how do you bring the development community along with some of these ideas? And I'm very much in the development community, but I would say that they are sheep. They kind of follow the trends. They don't necessarily lead. And I think two things will happen. One is the capital markets, where they get money, is harder and harder to find in a lot of these traditional methods, because what happened out of 2008, the good news out of 2008 and all that, is a lot of the forms of development that we probably feel are not sustainable didn't perform very well from a financial standpoint, so they're not going to be able to get funded again. And the stuff, ironically, the things that were always seen as too complex and too unproven and all that actually performed pretty well. So the money now is really starting to look at both product types and importantly locations that have much more of this kind of energy and mixed use and all those kinds of things going on. But it's going to be a while. And sometimes it has to be a very creative public-private partnership to prove the market. So there has to be some kind of a really creative, public sector, private sector, NGO-led project that suddenly shows, boy, we built 40 townhouses and they sold overnight. Wow, there must be a market for that after all. And then all the developers will be in there when they see that kind of thing. But somebody has to be creative and pioneering that. So, okay.
Well, thank you, Jim. That was very entertaining.